Before Eve walked in the Garden of Eden, before the rib was ever taken, there was another woman, and her name was Lilith. This is the story they don't want you to know, the story that was systematically removed from every Bible you've ever read, buried in ancient texts that the church tried to destroy, hidden in dusty scrolls that scholars whisper about but rarely discuss publicly. This is about the first rebellion in human history, the first act of defiance against divine authority, and the woman who refused to submit, who refused to obey, who looked at the order of creation itself and said, "No." Let's go back to the beginning, to Genesis, to the moment of creation itself. You know the story, or at least you think you do. God creates Adam from the dust of the earth, breathes life into him, places him in the Garden of Eden. Adam walks alone, names the animals, tends the garden, but something is missing. God says it is not good for man to be alone, and so he causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, takes one of his ribs, and from that rib creates Eve, the mother of all living. That's the story you were taught in Sunday school, the story that's been repeated for thousands of years, the foundation of patriarchal religious structure that has shaped Western civilization. But there's a problem with this story, a massive problem that becomes apparent when you actually read Genesis carefully. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." Male and female, created together, at the same time, equal. But then, in Genesis chapter 2, we get a completely different creation story. Suddenly, Adam is created first, alone, and only later, as an afterthought, is woman created from his rib. Two completely different accounts of creation, sitting right next to each other in the same book. Biblical scholars have known about this contradiction for centuries. They call it the two creation accounts problem. The typical explanation is that these are two different oral traditions that were later combined into one text, or that chapter 1 is a poetic overview, while chapter 2 is a detailed narrative. But what if there's another explanation? What if Genesis chapter 1 is talking about a different woman entirely? What if the woman created equally with Adam in chapter 1 wasn't Eve at all? Enter Lilith. Her name appears only once in the canonical Bible, in Isaiah 34, verse 14, where she's translated as screech owl or night creature in most English versions, but in the original Hebrew, it's Lilith, a proper name. But in Jewish mystical texts, in the Kabbalah, in the alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries, in the Zohar, in countless rabbinic commentaries, Lilith is much more than a night creature.
She is Adam's first wife, created from the same earth as him, equal to him in every way, made in that first creation described in Genesis chapter 1. The story goes like this. God creates Adam and Lilith simultaneously from the earth, not one from the other, but both from the same source material, both equal, both human, both made in God's image. They live together in Eden, but almost immediately there's conflict. Adam wants Lilith to lie beneath him during intercourse, to assume a submissive position. Lilith refuses. She says, "Why should I lie beneath you when I am your equal? I was made from the same earth as you." This is the crucial moment, the point of no return. Adam insists. He's not asking, he's demanding. The very first power struggle in human history, and it's about bodily autonomy, about equality, about who has the right to determine the terms of intimate relationship. Lilith refuses to submit. She speaks the ineffable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, the 4 Hebrew letters that form God's true name, YHWH, which was forbidden to speak aloud. By speaking this name, she gains the power to fly, and she rises up into the air and flees from Eden, escaping to the Red Sea, a place associated with demons and chaos in ancient Jewish cosmology. Adam is devastated. He complains to God, "The woman you gave me has run away." And here's where it gets really interesting, because God's response tells us everything about the cosmic order that's being established. God sends 3 angels after Lilith, Senoi, Sansonoi, and Semangaloth. Their names are preserved in ancient texts, in amulets that Jewish mothers would hang over cribs to protect their babies from Lilith's revenge. These 3 angels fly to the Red Sea and find Lilith there. They deliver God's ultimatum: return to Adam or face consequences. The consequence? 100 of her children will die every day. Because by this point, Lilith has already been busy at the Red Sea. She's been coupling with demons, with fallen angels, producing offspring at a supernatural rate, giving birth to more than 100 children daily. These become the demons, the succubi, the evil spirits that haunt humanity. Lilith hears the angel's threat, and she makes a counteroffer. She will not return to Adam, will never submit to him. But she makes a deal about her children. She agrees that 100 of her demon offspring will die each day. But in exchange, she gains power over human children. Any baby not protected by an amulet bearing the names of those 3 angels, any infant left unguarded during its first 8 days of life, belongs to her. She becomes the killer of infants, the night demon, the succubus who seduces men in their sleep and steals babies from their cribs. This is why, in ancient Jewish tradition, amulets with those angel names were hung in nurseries, why certain prayers were recited to protect newborns, why women after childbirth were considered especially vulnerable during the first week.
The angels return to God and report that Lilith will not come back. And this is when God makes a decision that changes everything. Instead of forcing Lilith to return, instead of making Adam deal with an equal partner who refuses to submit, God chooses to create a different woman, a woman who will be subordinate by her very nature, subordinate by the method of her creation. This is when God puts Adam into a deep sleep and creates Eve from his rib, from his own body, so that she will forever be seen as derivative, as secondary, as created for man rather than created with man. Eve is the compromise, the replacement, the woman designed to fit into a patriarchal structure. And it works. Eve is submissive, at least initially. She doesn't question Adam's authority. She doesn't refuse him. She's the good wife that Lilith refused to be. But notice something crucial here. Eve is the one who later eats from the tree of knowledge. Eve is the one who dooms humanity, at least according to traditional Christian interpretation. The submissive woman still brings about the fall. The woman created to be obedient still disobeys. Maybe the problem was never about submission or equality. Maybe the problem was always about human free will itself.
about the impossibility of creating beings with consciousness and choice and expecting them to never exercise that choice. But let's go back to Lilith, because her story doesn't end with her refusal to return to Eden. In Jewish folklore, she becomes a central figure, a demon queen, the first wife of Samael, who is basically Satan in Jewish demonology. She roams the night, she seduces sleeping men, she steals the nocturnal emissions of men and uses their seed to create more demon children. In the Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism, Lilith is described as the queen of the demons, the consort of evil itself. She has long hair, she's sexually seductive. She represents uncontrolled female sexuality, female power that refuses to be contained within patriarchal boundaries. Medieval Jewish texts are full of warnings about Lilith. Men are told not to sleep alone in a house because Lilith might visit them. Women are given elaborate rituals to protect their children. The fear of Lilith permeates ancient Jewish culture in a way that's hard to overstate. She's not just a boogeyman. She's a real spiritual threat that requires constant vigilance, constant protection, constant prayer. And here's what's fascinating. This isn't just Jewish tradition. Lilith appears in Babylonian texts dating back to 2400 BCE. The Burney relief, also called the Queen of the Night relief, shows a winged female figure flanked by owls, standing on lions, and many scholars believe this is Lilith. She's mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where she's a demon who lives in the trunk of a sacred tree until she's driven out. The Sumerians called her Lilitu, a class of female demons. The Akkadians knew her as Ardot Lili. She's pan-Mesopotamian. Her roots go back to the very beginning of written human history. This isn't a medieval invention. This isn't rabbinical fan fiction. This is a figure who has haunted human mythology for 4,000 years. And yet, when the Hebrew Bible was being compiled, when the texts that would become the Old Testament were being selected and edited and approved, Lilith was almost completely removed. That single reference in Isaiah, mistranslated as a night bird or screech owl, is all that remains in the canonical text. Why? Why was she erased? The answer becomes clear when you understand what Lilith represents. She represents female autonomy, female sexuality that isn't controlled by or for men, female power that exists independent of male authority. In a patriarchal religious structure that's trying to establish men as the heads of households, as the spiritual leaders, as the ones who commune directly with God, while women remain subordinate, Lilith is a problem. She's a huge problem. Because if the first woman was equal to the first man, if she was created the same way he was, from the same material, with the same divine breath, then the entire structure of male religious authority collapses. Think about how much of traditional religious law depends on women being secondary. In Orthodox Judaism, women can't be rabbis, can't lead prayers when men are present, don't count toward a minyan, the quorum needed for public worship. In traditional Christianity, women couldn't be priests or ministers in most denominations until very recently, and many denominations still forbid it. In Islam, women can't lead mixed-gender prayers, can't be imams in most interpretations. All of this depends on a theological foundation that women are somehow spiritually secondary to men, that they have a different role in God's plan, that they were created as helpers and companions, not as equals and partners. But if Lilith was first, if she was equal, if she was created alongside Adam in that Genesis chapter 1 creation, then that entire foundation crumbles. Suddenly, you have to confront the possibility that patriarchal religious structure isn't divinely ordained, but humanly constructed. That it's a choice that was made, not a cosmic truth that was revealed. And that's dangerous. That's the kind of idea that threatens the entire power structure of organized religion as it existed for thousands of years. So Lilith had to go. Her story had to be suppressed, marginalized, turned into demon mythology, transformed from the first woman into the first demon. But they couldn't completely erase her because she was too embedded in the oral tradition, too present in folklore, too powerful in the collective unconscious. So she survives, in fragments, in mystical texts that most people never read, in amulets and charms, in whispered warnings about night demons and infant death. The question is, who did this erasing? When did it happen? And how?
Women should not teach or have authority over men. Women should submit to their husbands as to the Lord. The creation story of Eve from Adam's rib is used by Paul to justify male authority. He literally says in 1 Timothy 2:13, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve," using the order of creation to establish a hierarchy. If Lilith's story was widely known, if it was in the accepted scriptures, Paul's argument falls apart. You can't use creation order to establish male authority if there was a first woman who was created at the same time as Adam and was his equal. So Lilith had to stay gone, had to remain in the shadows, had to be forgotten or demonized. The Catholic Church, as it rose to power in Rome and spread across Europe, became even more systematic about controlling religious texts and traditions. The Latin Vulgate, translated by Jerome in the late 4th century, became the only authorized version of the Bible for Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Jerome had access to Hebrew texts that no longer exist, had knowledge of Jewish traditions that were later lost. When he translated Isaiah 34:14, he chose to render Lilith as Lamia, a Greek female demon, rather than preserving her name. Later translations went further, turning her into an owl or a night creature or a wild beast, completely obscuring that there was ever a proper name there at all. During the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church had absolute control over religious knowledge in Europe, when the Bible was only available in Latin and only priests could read it, when translating the Bible into common languages was a heresy punishable by death, the Church had total control over which stories were told and which were suppressed. The Inquisition wasn't just about hunting heretics. It was about controlling information, controlling narrative, controlling what people believed about God and creation and salvation and the proper order of society. Any text that suggested Lilith was real, was Adam's first wife, was equal to him, would have been destroyed as heretical. The printing press changed everything. When Gutenberg printed the Bible in the 1450s, when Luther translated it into German, when Tyndale translated it into English and was burned at the stake for doing so, suddenly ordinary people could read Scripture for themselves. But by this point, Lilith was long gone from the canonical text. She existed only in Jewish mystical traditions that most Christians never encountered, in Kabbalistic texts that were considered esoteric and dangerous, in folklore that was dismissed as superstition. The Protestant Reformation didn't help Lilith's case.
If anything, it made things worse, because Protestant reformers were committed to sola scriptura, Scripture alone as the basis for faith. If it wasn't in the Bible, it wasn't true. And Lilith wasn't in the Bible, not in any recognizable way.
So, Protestant Christianity, which might have been an opportunity to recover suppressed traditions, instead further marginalized them by insisting that only canonical scripture mattered. Throughout all of this, though, Jewish tradition kept Lilith alive. The Kabbalah, which developed in medieval Spain and southern France, made Lilith a central figure in mystical cosmology. The Zohar, written in the 13th century, contains extensive passages about Lilith, her origins, her nature, her continuing war against humanity and God. Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist, developed elaborate theories about Lilith's place in the structure of evil and the cosmic plan for redemption. Amulets to ward off Lilith were common in Jewish homes throughout Europe and the Middle East well into the 20th century. But for Christians, Lilith was gone. Erased so thoroughly that when she started reappearing in Western consciousness in the 19th and 20th centuries, most people had no idea who she was or where she came from. The rediscovery of Lilith in modern Western culture is its own fascinating story. In the 19th century, as scholars began studying comparative mythology and ancient Near Eastern texts, as archaeology uncovered Babylonian and Sumerian tablets, Lilith started coming back into view. The pre-Raphaelite painters in England became obsessed with her. Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted her as a beautiful, sensual woman brushing her hair, representing dangerous female sexuality. John Collier painted Lilith in 1892, showing a nude woman wrapped by a serpent, explicitly connecting her to the serpent in Eden, suggesting she was the one who tempted Eve, not Satan. In literature, George MacDonald wrote a fantasy novel called Lilith in 1895, where she's an immortal demon queen. George Bernard Shaw referenced her in Back to Methuselah. Aleister Crowley incorporated her into his occult system. But it was in the 20th century that Lilith really returned, and she returned as a feminist icon. In 1972, Jewish feminist scholar Judith Plasko wrote a poem called The Coming of Lilith, imagining Lilith and Eve meeting and reconciling, joining together against patriarchal oppression. This kicked off a whole movement of Jewish feminism that reclaimed Lilith as a symbol of female empowerment, of refusal to submit to unjust authority, of female sexuality that isn't defined by male desire. The first independent Jewish feminist magazine was called Lilith, founded in 1976 and still publishing today. Women's music festivals and feminist spiritual gatherings in the 1970s and 80s often invoked Lilith as a patron saint of female rebellion. Feminist theologians began seriously studying the Lilith traditions, arguing that her suppression was a deliberate act of patriarchal censorship, that recovering her story was essential to creating more egalitarian religious traditions.
But this feminist reclamation also sparked backlash.
Suddenly, the hierarchy isn't inevitable, isn't divinely ordained, but is the result of one woman's refusal and the subsequent creation of a replacement who would be more compliant. Suddenly, we're not talking about cosmic order, but about a failure of relationship, about an inability to navigate equality and difference, about a choice to create subordination rather than to work through conflict. The church didn't just erase Lilith from the Bible. They erased the possibility of imagining that things could have been different from the beginning, that equality could have been the foundation rather than something to be slowly, painfully achieved over millennia of struggle. This is why censorship matters, why controlling narratives matters, why having access to suppressed texts and alternative traditions matters. It's not just about academic curiosity or historical accuracy. It's about what visions of human possibility we're allowed to imagine. Let's dig deeper into the specific texts where Lilith appears, because understanding exactly what was written about her and when helps us see how her story evolved and was suppressed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near Qumran, contain some of the oldest biblical manuscripts ever found, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. Among these scrolls is a text called the Songs of the Sage, which contains an incantation against demons, and Lilith is named among them. This proves that belief in Lilith existed in Jewish tradition at least 2,000 years ago, contemporaneous with early Christianity. The fact that she's being warded against in protective incantations tells us she was considered a real spiritual threat, not just a mythological figure. The Testament of Solomon, a pseudepigraphal text probably written in the 1st to 3rd century CE, describes King Solomon interrogating demons, and one of them describes being subject to a female demon who preys on women in childbirth and newborn children. While not explicitly named as Lilith in all versions, the description matches her perfectly. This text was widely read in early Christianity, but was never canonized, never made it into the official Bible. Why not? It contains too much about demons having personalities and stories, about magic and occult knowledge, about spiritual warfare in terms that were too specific and too close to pagan sorcery for comfort. But it also preserves this tradition of a female night demon who kills babies, a tradition that clearly links to Lilith. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 6th century CE, contains multiple references to Lilith. In Niddah 24b, there's a discussion of a female demon figure. In Shabbat 151b, men are warned not to sleep alone in a house because they might be seized by Lilith. In Erubin 100b, there's a discussion about how to have sex properly, and it mentions demons, possibly including Lilith. These aren't peripheral texts. This is the Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, the foundation of Jewish law and practice. Lilith is in there, acknowledged as real, warned against, treated as a genuine threat. But when Christianity split from Judaism, when the two religions went their separate ways, Christians didn't take the Talmud with them. They took only the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and in that text, Lilith appears only once, hidden in Isaiah 34. The alphabet of Ben Sira, written probably in the 8th to 10th century CE in the Middle East, contains the most detailed version of the Lilith and Adam story.
It tells of Adam and Lilith arguing about sex positions, her speaking God's name and flying away, the three angels pursuing her, her deal with them, and Eve's subsequent creation. This text is controversial because it's written in a satirical, provocative style. It includes sexual content that's quite explicit for religious literature. And it seems designed to mock or challenge conventional piety. Some scholars argue this means it's not a serious theological text and shouldn't be taken as authentic tradition. Others argue that satire and provocation don't make something false, that the alphabet is preserving genuine old oral traditions in a deliberately shocking literary form, that it's making serious points about gender and power through irreverent storytelling. Either way, by the time this was written, Lilith was already established enough in Jewish tradition that the author could assume readers knew who she was. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, written in 13th century Spain by Moses de Leon, contains extensive material about Lilith. It describes her as the wife of Samael, the demon king, as the ruler of the demonic feminine, as the opposite and enemy of the Shekhinah, the divine feminine presence of God. In Zoharic cosmology, reality is structured in divine emanations called Sephirot, and Lilith represents the dark underside of the Sephirah of Malchut, kingdom, the divine feminine gone wrong. This is sophisticated mystical theology, not folklore or superstition. Lilith is being incorporated into a complex metaphysical system that attempts to explain the structure of reality, the nature of evil, and the relationship between masculine and feminine in the divine realm. The Zohar was hugely influential in Jewish thought, and it cemented Lilith as a permanent figure in Jewish mysticism. Yet it was never accepted by Christianity, never translated into Latin or other European languages in the medieval period, remained the property of a relatively small group of Jewish scholars and mystics. When we map this out chronologically, a pattern emerges. In the earliest period, Lilith is a Mesopotamian demon figure, attested in Sumerian and Babylonian texts. By the late Second Temple period, 1st century BC to 1st century CE, she's been incorporated into Jewish demonology, appearing in incantations and protective texts. By the Talmudic period, 3rd to 6th century CE, she's an established figure in rabbinic discussion, known and warned against. By the medieval period, 8th to 13th century CE, her story is being elaborated in texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira and the Zohar, becoming more detailed and more central to mystical Judaism. But during this entire timeline, as her story is being developed and preserved in Jewish tradition, she's being excluded from Christian scripture and tradition. The early church fathers, Origen, Augustine, Jerome, Chrysostom, none of them discuss Lilith. The medieval theologians, Aquinas, Anselm, Abelard, none of them mention her. The Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, ignore her completely. This isn't because they didn't know about Jewish traditions. Church authorities were deeply engaged with Jewish texts for polemical purposes, to argue against Judaism, to prove Christian supersessionism. They knew what Jews believed and practiced. They chose not to engage with Lilith, chose to treat her as Jewish superstition not worthy of Christian attention. And this choice was easier because she wasn't in the canonical text, because that one reference in Isaiah could be translated away into a bird or animal, because there was no obligation to explain or address her. Now let's talk about the Isaiah passage specifically, because this is where Lilith's only canonical appearance happens, and it's fascinating how it's been handled in translation. Isaiah 34:14 in the Hebrew reads, Upagash tziyim et iyim, ve'sa'ir al rehu yikra, ach sharm hirgiha lilit, umatza la manoach. In most English Bibles, this gets translated something like, the wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the jackals, and the wild goat shall bleat to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. The word Lilith in the Hebrew has been translated as screech owl. Why? Because there's no good English word for Lilith. Because translators didn't want to use her name and require an explanation. Because rendering her as an animal removes the problem entirely. But in the Latin Vulgate, Jerome translated it as Lamia, which is a Greek demon, a female monster that drinks blood and eats children. Jerome knew who Lilith was. He made a choice to connect her to Greek demonology rather than just turning her into a bird. The King James Version, following earlier English translations, went with screech owl, and most Protestant English Bibles have followed suit. More recent translations vary. The New International Version says night creatures. The New American Standard Bible says night monster, which is closer to the truth, but still vague. The English Standard Version says night bird. Only a few very literal translations, like Young's literal translation, actually preserve Lilith as a name. This is linguistic erasure happening in real time, happening every time someone picks up a Bible in English and reads Isaiah 34 without knowing that there's a proper name being hidden behind words like owl or night creature. The context of Isaiah 34 is important too. This is a prophecy of doom against Edom, describing how the land will be utterly destroyed and become haunted by demons and wild animals. In this context, Lilith is listed among the creatures that will inhabit ruins, alongside jackals and wild goats and other desert scavengers and spirits. This is the only time the Hebrew Bible mentions her by name, and it's treating her as a known entity, as something the audience would recognize without explanation, as an evil spirit associated with desolate places. The fact that Isaiah can drop her name without explanation suggests she was well known in 8th century BCE Judah when Isaiah was written. She wasn't a fringe belief or obscure demon. She was familiar enough that the prophet could use her name as shorthand for the kind of evil spiritual forces that inhabit destroyed cities. This makes her suppression even more significant. She wasn't removed from the text because she was unimportant or unknown, but precisely because she was important and well known, because that made her dangerous. Let's talk about what the Vatican specifically did regarding Lilith. The Vatican doesn't have a central archive where there's a file labeled Suppressed Story of Lilith. No smoking gun document where a pope orders her removal from Scripture. It's more subtle and more systemic than that. The Vatican's role in suppressing Lilith happens through several mechanisms. First, the control of biblical canon. The Catholic Church at various councils, especially Hippo and Carthage in the late 4th century, established which books were inspired scripture and which were not. They chose the Hebrew Bible texts that became the Old Testament, and those texts had already been edited by Jewish scribes to minimize or remove Lilith. The Church could have included other texts, Jewish apocalyptic literature, wisdom books, historical narratives that might have contained more about Lilith, but they didn't. They accepted the canon as it was, which meant accepting the erasure. Second, the control of translation. For over 1,000 years, the Latin Vulgate was the only authorized Bible in Western Christianity. What Jerome chose to do with that Isaiah passage, rendering Lilith as a Greek demon rather than preserving her Hebrew name, became standard. When vernacular translations began appearing, they had to be approved by church authorities, and those authorities preferred translations that avoided complications like proper names of demons that would require explanation. Third, the suppression of Jewish texts and traditions. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had a deeply ambivalent relationship with Jewish learning.
On one hand, Christian scholars recognized that Jews had knowledge of Hebrew and ancient traditions that could be useful. On the other hand, Jewish texts were often condemned as heretical, blasphemous, or dangerous. The Talmud was burned in Paris in 1242, over 12,000 manuscripts destroyed. This happened repeatedly across Europe. While the burnings were primarily motivated by passages that Christians found offensive to Christianity, the effect was to destroy the very texts where Lilith traditions were preserved. The Kabbalistic texts that contained extensive Lilith material were considered especially dangerous because they dealt with mysticism and magic, because they claimed esoteric knowledge, because they represented exactly the kind of spiritual knowledge that the Church wanted to control. When Jewish communities were expelled from Spain in 1492, from Portugal in 1497, from various Italian states and German territories over the centuries, their libraries and manuscripts often went with them or were destroyed. The institutional memory of Jewish tradition was disrupted, and with it, the transmission of texts about Lilith. Fourth, the Inquisition's control of information. The Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition. These weren't just about hunting heretics. They were about controlling what people could read and believe. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books maintained by the Vatican from 1559 to 1966, banned thousands of books. While it primarily focused on Protestant works and works of science that contradicted church teaching, it also banned books dealing with magic, mysticism, and esoteric knowledge. Any Christian text that tried to seriously engage with Jewish mystical traditions, including material about Lilith, would have been suspect. Any attempt to publish a translation of the Zohar or other Kabbalistic texts into Latin or vernacular European languages would have been stopped. The effect was that Lilith remained locked in Hebrew texts that most Christians couldn't read, in traditions that were practiced only in Jewish communities that were increasingly marginalized and ghettoized. Fifth, the theological framework that made Lilith impossible to acknowledge. Catholic theology developed elaborate doctrines about gender, sexuality, and marriage based on the Genesis 2 creation story. The idea that woman was created from man's rib became the foundation for teachings about male headship, female submission, the subordination of wives to husbands. Canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, was built on this foundation. Women couldn't be ordained, couldn't consecrate the Eucharist, couldn't hold ecclesiastical authority, all because of theological arguments rooted in creation order and the nature of woman as created from and for man. If Lilith's story was acknowledged, if there was a first woman created equal to Adam who refused to submit, the entire theological edifice would be threatened. It wasn't necessary to explicitly suppress Lilith because the theological system had no room for her. She was incompatible with Catholic teaching about gender and therefore simply couldn't be true.
This is perhaps the most insidious form of censorship, not the burning of books or the banning of ideas, but the creation of a conceptual framework where certain ideas become literally unthinkable, where they can't even be entertained because they violate the fundamental assumptions of the system. Protestant Christianity, despite its break with Rome, largely continued this suppression. Luther, Calvin, and other reformers rejected Catholic tradition and authority, but they kept the same biblical canon, the same basic interpretation of Genesis, the same teachings about gender hierarchy rooted in creation order. In some ways, Protestant suppression of Lilith was even more complete than Catholic, because Protestants rejected mysticism and esoteric tradition entirely. At least in Catholicism, there was room for mystical speculation within approved bounds, within monastery walls, in the visions of saints. But Protestantism's commitment to sola scriptura, scripture alone, meant that anything not explicitly in the Bible was automatically suspect. Since Lilith wasn't explicitly in the Protestant Bible, her name being translated away in Isaiah, she couldn't be part of Protestant theology or spirituality. When you map this out, you see a sustained, multi-layered effort across centuries and across different Christian traditions to keep Lilith suppressed, to keep her story from circulating, to prevent Christians from encountering the idea of a first woman who was Adam's equal and who refused to submit. This wasn't a conspiracy in the sense of people meeting in secret rooms plotting to hide Lilith. It was a systemic bias, a theological commitment that made suppressing Lilith the natural, logical, inevitable outcome. Everyone involved, from bishops to translators to theologians to inquisitors, were working within a framework that required female subordination to be divinely ordained, creation-based, unchangeable. Lilith contradicted that framework and therefore had to be denied, ignored, translated away, or condemned as Jewish superstition. Now let's address the counterarguments, because there are legitimate questions about how much of the Lilith story is ancient tradition versus medieval elaboration, and whether calling this erasure is historically accurate. Some scholars argue that the full Lilith story, with her creation equal to Adam and her refusal to submit sexually, doesn't appear in any text earlier than the alphabet of Ben Sira from the 8th to 10th century CE. They point out that this is over 1,000 years after Genesis was written, over 500 years after the Talmud was compiled.
The argument is that Lilith as Adam's first wife is a medieval invention, not an ancient tradition, and therefore couldn't have been erased from the Bible because she was never part of the earliest biblical tradition in the first place. This is a serious objection and deserves serious engagement. Here's what we can say. First, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when it comes to oral traditions. Just because the earliest written version of a story dates to the medieval period doesn't mean the story itself originated then. Oral traditions can persist for centuries before being written down. We know this from comparative mythology, from folklore studies, from countless examples of stories that were passed down orally for generations before finally being recorded. The Iliad and Odyssey were oral poems for hundreds of years before being written. The Finnish epic Kalevala was oral tradition until collected in the 19th century. The fact that the full Lilith and Adam story is first written in the alphabet doesn't prove it was invented by the author of the alphabet. Second, we have earlier fragments that point to the existence of a larger tradition. Lilith appears by name in Isaiah from the 8th century BCE.
She appears in Dead Sea Scroll incantations from the 2nd century BCE. She appears in the Talmud from the 3rd to 6th century CE. She appears in the Testament of Solomon from the 1st to 3rd century CE. These references are brief, but they assume knowledge of who Lilith is. Isaiah doesn't explain who she is. The Talmud warns against her without giving her origin story. The incantations use her name as known and understood. This pattern is consistent with a figure who has an established mythology that doesn't need to be fully recounted every time she's mentioned. Think about how modern texts mention vampires or zombies or werewolves without explaining their full mythology because everyone already knows. The brief ancient references to Lilith suggest she had a well-known story that didn't need to be fully written out every time. Third, the 2 creation accounts in Genesis are in the text, unexplained. Genesis 1:27 says male and female were created together. Genesis 2:7 and 2:21-22 say Adam was created first and Eve was created later from his rib. This is a genuine contradiction that has troubled commentators for thousands of years. The Lilith story provides an explanation for this contradiction. It's not impossible that this explanation was invented in the medieval period to solve a textual problem. But it's also not impossible that the explanation existed earlier in oral tradition and was finally written down in the medieval period. The fact that different rabbinic authorities across centuries tried to explain this contradiction suggests it was a recognized problem that needed solving. Fourth, the Mesopotamian Lilith figure dates back to at least 2400 BCE in Sumerian texts. This isn't controversial.
The Burney Relief, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Babylonian demon lists all contain references to Lilith or Lilitu figures. These predate the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. The Hebrews were in Mesopotamia during the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, exactly the period when much of the Hebrew Bible was being compiled and edited. It would be strange if they didn't encounter and incorporate Mesopotamian Lilith traditions. The question isn't whether Lilith was known to ancient Hebrews. The evidence shows she clearly was. The question is when her story became connected to Adam and Genesis. And here, we genuinely don't know. We don't have a text before the alphabet of Ben Sira that explicitly tells the full story. But we have the pieces. An ancient Mesopotamian demon named Lilith, a Hebrew Bible that mentions her once and has 2 contradictory creation accounts, Talmudic references that treat her as known and dangerous, protective amulets that invoke her name, folk tales about her stealing babies and seducing men. All of these pieces could be independent, or they could be fragments of a larger narrative that wasn't fully written down until medieval times. Personally, based on the pattern of evidence, I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. There was likely an ancient tradition connecting Lilith to the Genesis creation story, probably going back at least to Talmudic times and possibly earlier. But this tradition existed primarily in oral form, in folk beliefs, in mystical speculation. The medieval texts, like the Alphabet and the Zohar, elaborated and systematized this tradition, gave it literary form, added details and theological sophistication. But they weren't inventing from whole cloth. They were building on something older. Even if we grant the most skeptical position that the full story is medieval invention, we're still left with the fact that this tradition existed in Judaism for over 1,000 years and was completely ignored or suppressed by Christianity.
Even if Lilith, as Adam's first wife, originated in the 9th century CE, that's still 1,200 years of Jewish tradition that Christianity refused to engage with. That's still erasure, still suppression, still a choice to maintain a particular narrative about creation and gender that depends on ignoring alternative traditions. The other major counter-argument is that Lilith is clearly portrayed negatively in ancient texts as a demon, as evil, as something to be feared and warded against, not as a positive figure or feminist icon. This is absolutely true, and it's important to acknowledge. In ancient Jewish tradition, Lilith is not a hero. She's not someone to emulate. She's a threat, a killer of babies, a seducer of men, a demon who creates more demons. The amulets invoke protection against her. The prayers ask God to keep her away. The mystical texts describe her as the queen of evil, the consort of Satan, the enemy of humanity and God.
Modern feminist reclamation of Lilith has to grapple with this. You can't just pretend that ancient sources portrayed her positively when they clearly didn't. But here's the thing, the negative portrayal itself is informative. Why is Lilith portrayed as evil? Because she refused to submit to Adam? Because she insisted on equality? Because she wouldn't accept a subordinate position? Because she fled rather than obey? The story makes her refusal to submit into the origin of her evil. The message is clear. Women who refuse to submit to male authority are demonic, are dangerous, or threats to social and cosmic order. This is patriarchy turning female autonomy into evil, female sexuality into danger, female equality into chaos. The demonization of Lilith is itself evidence of what the patriarchal religious establishment feared and needed to suppress. She had to be turned into a monster because what she actually represented, female equality and autonomy, was too threatening to acknowledge as legitimate. So yes, ancient sources portray Lilith negatively, but that negative portrayal reveals the anxiety about female power that drives it. Modern feminist reclamation isn't ignoring the negative portrayal, it's reading it critically, understanding what it reveals about the values and fears of the culture that created it. When feminists claim Lilith as a symbol, they're not saying ancient rabbis thought she was great. They're saying her refusal to submit deserves to be honored rather than demonized. That the very traits that made ancient patriarchy call her evil, autonomy, sexual agency, refusal to accept arbitrary authority, are actually virtues, not vices. The last major counterargument is about intent. Did the people who compiled the Bible and translated it and taught it actually intend to suppress Lilith, or were they just making the choices that seemed right to them based on their understanding of Scripture and tradition? This matters because erasure and suppression imply deliberate action with conscious intent, and maybe that's not fair to people who were simply trying to faithfully preserve and transmit sacred texts according to their best judgment. This is a fair point, and I don't want to suggest there was a mustache-twirling conspiracy of villains deliberately hiding the truth. Most of the people involved in creating and maintaining biblical canon were sincere believers trying to do what they thought was right. But intent doesn't change outcome. Even if every scribe and bishop and translator was acting in good faith according to their understanding, the effect was still to remove Lilith from the canonical narrative, to render her invisible to most of Christianity, to prevent her story from challenging patriarchal theology. And moreover, I think we can say there was intent, even if not malicious intent.
When Jerome translated Lilith as Lamia, he made a choice. Third, we recover and honor suppressed traditions, not because they're necessarily more true than canonical traditions, but because they give us a fuller picture of ancient belief, and because they may contain wisdom and insight that was lost in the process of canonization. The Gnostic Gospels, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, Kabbalistic texts, these aren't just academic curiosities. They're windows into the diversity of ancient religious thought, into the roads not taken, into the forms of Judaism and Christianity that existed before orthodoxy narrowed the range of acceptable belief. Lilith is part of this suppressed tradition, and she deserves to be known. Fourth, we think seriously about what the Lilith story tells us about gender and power. Whether you read it as ancient tradition or medieval invention, the story is powerful. A woman created equal to man who refuses to accept subordination, who chooses freedom over security, who becomes demonized precisely because of her refusal to submit. This pattern, woman's autonomy portrayed as danger, woman's resistance portrayed as evil, shows up everywhere in patriarchal culture, from Eve the temptress to dangerous witches to femme fatales to the nasty woman of contemporary politics. Understanding how this pattern works, how female power gets constructed as threatening, helps us recognize and resist it. And fifth, we imagine what might have been different. What if Lilith had stayed in the biblical narrative? What if Genesis had clearly stated that God's first attempt at partnership was equality, and when that failed because of conflict, God tried subordination instead, creating Eve from Adam's rib? What would Christianity look like if it had to grapple with that story? Maybe it would have led to even more emphatic insistence on male authority, using Lilith as a cautionary tale about the chaos that ensues when women don't submit. Or maybe it would have opened space for questioning whether subordination was really God's ideal plan, or whether it was an accommodation to human sinfulness, like how Jesus said Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of people's hearts, not because it was God's original design. Maybe Christian feminism could have happened centuries earlier if there was biblical precedent for questioning gender hierarchy. We can't know, but it's worth thinking about. The story of Lilith, Adam's first wife, the woman who refused to submit, the woman the Vatican and Christian tradition erased from the Bible, matters because it tells us that the familiar narratives we inherit aren't the only narratives that existed, that alternative stories were told and preserved despite immense pressure to suppress them, that the questions we're asking now about equality and justice and gender and power are ancient questions that people were asking thousands of years ago, even if their answers were written out of the official record.
Lilith survives despite everything, despite being removed from Scripture, despite being turned into a demon, despite centuries of suppression. Her name persists, her story persists, and in the 21st century, she's more known, more discussed, more reclaimed than she's been in 2,000 years. That persistence means something. It means you can't completely erase a powerful story. You can't completely suppress a powerful idea. It means that truth, or at least truth about human nature and human history, has a way of surviving even deliberate attempts to bury it. The Church tried to erase Lilith, and for most of Christian history, they succeeded.
Most Christians lived and died never knowing she existed, never questioning the Genesis 2 creation story, never imagining that things could have been different. But Lilith is back now, and her story is being told again, and people are asking why it was suppressed in the first place. That's what makes this more than just an interesting piece of religious history. It's a lesson in how power works, how narratives are controlled, how inconvenient truths get buried, and how sometimes, despite everything, those truths find their way back into the light. When you read Genesis now, when you get to the 2 creation accounts, you can ask yourself, why are there 2 stories? Why does chapter 1 say male and female were created together, while chapter 2 says Adam was created first and Eve from his rib? And now you know there's an answer to that question, an answer preserved in Jewish tradition, suppressed in Christian tradition, an answer that involves a woman named Lilith who refused to be subordinate and chose freedom instead. Whether that answer is historically accurate or mythologically constructed doesn't matter, as much as the question itself, the question of why woman's subordination is presented as divinely ordained, is worth asking. And once you start asking it, once you realize that the narratives you were taught aren't the only narratives that existed, you can never quite read the text the same way again. That's why Lilith matters, why her story matters, why understanding how and why she was erased matters. It teaches us to read critically, to ask questions, to wonder what else might have been suppressed or forgotten or deliberately hidden. It teaches us that the authorities who claim to speak for God and truth have throughout history made choices about what to tell and what to hide, and those choices often served their own power and interests. And it teaches us that stories survive, that memory survives, that even when the institutions work to erase something, fragments persist, and sometimes those fragments are enough to reconstruct what was lost. Lilith, the first woman, the equal woman, the woman who said no, the woman who flew away, the woman the church tried to erase, she's still here, still speaking, still asking the questions that patriarchy has always feared. Why should I submit?
Why should I be beneath? Why should my creation from the same earth as you make me your subordinate? Who decided this order, and what gives it authority? These are dangerous questions, revolutionary questions, the kind of questions that threaten established hierarchies and demand justification for arrangements of power that prefer to be taken for granted as natural and inevitable. The erasure of Lilith was an attempt to prevent those questions from being asked, to make female subordination seem like cosmic law rather than human choice. The recovery of Lilith is an invitation to ask those questions again, to examine the foundations of beliefs about gender and power, to imagine that things could be different because they once were different. Because in the beginning, in at least one version of the beginning, there was equality, there was partnership, there was a woman who knew her worth and refused to accept anything less. That woman was Lilith. And now you know her story, the story they tried to erase, the story that survived anyway, the story that challenges us to think differently about creation, about gender, about power, about who gets to tell the story and what stories get told. The next time you read Genesis, the next time you encounter the creation story, remember Lilith.
Remember the woman who was erased. Remember why she had to be erased. And remember what her story, even in its suppressed and fragmented form, has to teach us about resistance, about autonomy, about the long history of women refusing to accept the roles that patriarchy assigned them, paying the price for that refusal, and still, despite everything, surviving. To tell the tale. Before the Lord, and in that smallness, to be great in what truly matters.